The following content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. It does not constitute means for diagnosis, healthcare advice, nor treatment. Make use of a qualified healthcare professional for such purposes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Charlene Ortiz, and today we are going to have a discussion about careers. What does the market look like for the fields in psychology, for psychologists, for counselors, and we're also, later on, we're going to talk about internships, right? The requirements, what does an internship look like? And the requirements that you may have when it comes to that application of an internship. So let's get started. Now, all of the information or most of the information that I am presenting here, I'm going to give you an opportunity to be able to pause the video or to take note of this because this is one of the links that I use very extensively to inform this presentation. So go ahead and take a minute to either write it down or pause the video so that you're able to access this document. All right, in general terms, when we are referring to psychology, psychology is a science, right? It is a science that is dedicated into studying the relationship between our brain and behavior. We are also interested in learning about the environment and its influence towards behavior and vice versa, right? So we are here in noticing this type of relationship. Now, something that I like to mention is that I consider psychology to be in the business of predicting behavior. Psychology is interested in predicting behavior because if I know what normal behavior looks like, then I can predict what abnormal behavior looks like. So I can provide treatment for that abnormality, right? So if I know that the average person is content, and I can predict what leads to being content, I can also predict, conversely, what leads a person of not being content. For example, symptoms of depression. So I do like to view psychology in that sense. Psychology as a science, right? Introducing the aspects of experimental psychology. Psychology is really new, right? Psychology, all things considered, is a new science, right? We're starting to notice more of the late 19th century. We're noticing more of that Victorian or post-Victorian aspect. So that was not that long ago. If you were to compare it to other fields, so for example, the field of medicine, right? How long have you been trying to find medication and aspects that can help a person medically? We've been doing that since the beginning of time. Whereas psychology as a science is actually really new when we started incorporating those scientific aspects, scientific method and application. So notice that it is pretty recent. But we can also look at psychology as an applied aspect of the scientific method. How do we know this? Because there are two main elements to psychology. The first one is that basic research, right? Basic research. We're trying to understand the foundations, the knowledge that we may need in order to understand the complexity of human behavior. Human behavior is immensely complex. It is not as easy as other hard sciences. For example, if I'm in physics and I'm trying to determine velocity, well, it's going to look the same across the board, right? Velocity is going to look the same here, than in Africa, than in Asia. However, behavior does look different from one country to the next. There's many aspects that involve, even within the same country, many individual aspects that affect behavior. So that is one of the reasons why we need basic research, at least basic research, in order to attain knowledge. Now, that's the first aspect of apply the scientific method in psychology. And the second aspect, if you will, is that applied research. When we are looking into applied research, that is what I like to refer to this body of information. This body of information. I'm going to utilize this body of information as a means to inform practice, right? So now I'm not solely focused on understanding behavior, but rather, whenever I conduct research, my goal is how am I going to apply this in the field? So those are two immensely significant components that make psychology a science. So any questions about that? Good deal. Now, it is important to note that psychology is not just a basic form of science. Notice that it is pretty broad. It also, not only is it broad within itself, but it also implies an interdisciplinary conjunction of other fields. So for example, the best way a professor ever explained this to me, if there's behavior, there's psychology, right? So for example, if I am looking into a factory, if I'm looking at people walking down the street, if I am looking at a person laying alone in their room because they have depression, notice that wherever there is behavior, there is psychology. Because of that, we make use of a wide variety of fields: biology, evolution, chemistry. We use a lot of different aspects, other fields, sociology, religion. We use a lot of other fields in order to inform our own, and vice versa, right? We utilize psychology as a means to inform other fields. As I mentioned earlier, we do not only focus on normal behavior, right? Because we have to consider both normal and abnormal behavior. So any questions about that? Good deal. Good deal. Now you heard me use the term research, right? And we all know what research is, what? But let's think about how are we going to define it. The intent is to find the fundamentals, right? The fundamentals of behavior. What makes behavior behavior? What leads to those gears turning? Now, when I'm referring to the term practice, I want you to think about the application of said knowledge in order to solve real daily problems. And people sometimes when we conduct research, some people would say doing research for the sake of doing research is not important, because if I can apply it to real world problems, to that patient or that client sitting right in front of me, therefore that research should not be considered. The thing is, we also need to learn the fundamentals, right? So even if that research doesn't necessarily apply directly to that client sitting in front of you, is still necessary, because if I don't know what a phenomenon looks like, I cannot help you. So that's another reason why we need research. Now, interestingly, let's define the term psychologist. Let's define the term psychologist. A psychologist is a person that generally holds a doctorate, whether it be a philosophy doctorate, a psychology doctorate, or holds an education doctorate. Generally, these are the different types of doctorates that a psychologist will hold. So that's perhaps the first characteristic. Notice that they both have a different focus. Let's talk about these two first. The focus of a PhD is doing everything from research to application, to practice, right? So a person who holds a PhD can both do research and do practice. However, an individual who holds a PsyD, their focus is not to do research, but only do practice, right? And that's something that I need to explain, because some of you right? Especially you guys that take the research class with me. Maybe this is the worst form of torture you've ever experienced, taking this research class with me, right? Because a lot of people do not enjoy the research component of things. So if you don't, and you're looking forward to working with clients, perhaps a PsyD is a better fit for you. However, if you're wanting to teach, if you're wanting to do research of your own, working for, say, the CDC, a hospital, a university, conducting research, then perhaps a PhD is better for you. Now, an EDD, in order to become a psychologist, some states require that you take more practice courses. So once you graduate, you might be required to do a postdoc, right? To get a master's after the fact, because you may not have all of the necessary skills or education that is needed to be a psychologist with an EDD. That does vary, however, from state to state. The second thing, we talked about the first requirement for a psychologist, which is education, right? So our first one is education, right? Generally holding a doctorate. I believe this is true for every single state and territory of the United States. So Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, wherever in America that you are generally required to have a doctorate. Now, the second requirement to be a psychologist is to become licensed, right? To become licensed. So what does that mean? It means that there are legal requirements for you to meet whenever you are wanting to take an exam. Generally, this examination is conducted by the state, and there is a national exam that does apply to the United States and its territories, so Guam, things of that nature, American Samoa, all of the other territories, and the same exam is used in Canada. So basically all of North America is what I'm trying to say. It takes the same exact exam. The only difference is that each state adds a little bit to that exam, and they add their own ethics board and their own state laws about psychology. So that's something you need to prepare yourself for. Now, currently I'm in that process, right? I'm in that process of having full licensure. So that's the process that I am in, which is therefore what I do not represent myself as a psychologist, and I make that very, very clear, very, very clear. So any questions about that? Now let's look into applied fields, right? I would argue that clinical psychology can be both, but I understand the intent of defining it as an applied field. So in regards to clinical psychology, remember, if I use the term applied, what I mean is practice, right? That's what I'm referring to. So this means that these fields, their intent is to be with the client or to be with that subject, right? Understanding the subject. We have clinical psychology, and we're actually going to discuss a little bit more in detail what that is. And that is my specialty, right? Clinical psychology, and my specialty, that's my major, and my other specialty is forensics. So we're also going to talk about that a little bit more. We also have industrial organizational psychology and human factors. If you're really into human factors, right, that relationship between technology and humans, you should really talk to Dr. Nate. He's part of our department, and he holds a doctorate in human factors. So he is a really good resource whenever we are talking about human factors. So let's look at service fields. Any questions about the primary applied fields? Good deal. When we're thinking about these subfields, right? One of the first ones that's going to come to mind is clinical psychology and counseling psychology. Now, I will link a description that is very, very much in detail of clinical and counseling psychology. So that will also be linked in the description below. But what is the main focus of both clinical and counseling? Their main focus is addressing disorders. That is their main intent, is to address mental illnesses, addressing disorders. Now, one of the main differences that I like to point out, because you're thinking, well, if they're both there to address disorders, what's the difference, right? What's the difference? The main difference between clinical psychology and counseling psychology is that counseling psychology deals with what I like to call acute disorders, short-term problems, right? For instance, getting a divorce, adjusting to that change to where you were married and now you're single. That's going to lead to, I see a couple heads saying, yeah, that is a lot of problems, huh? You had a boyfriend and now you don't. That is an adjustment concern, right? A counselor perhaps would be a better fit for that type of problem. They deal with acute. In acute, every time you hear that word, I want you to think about shorter term, right? Psychologists, or rather persons who specialize in the clinical sense, also deal with disorders, but they deal, instead of acute, they deal with the chronic, meaning long-term. For example, schizophrenia, borderline, narcissism, right? I bet some of you know a couple narcissists, right? It's not as common as people think, right? That disorder is not as common. Thinking about dissociative identity disorder, what we used to refer to as multiple personality disorder, autism, right? Long-term conditions. That doesn't mean that a person who specializes in the clinical field cannot deal with adjustment disorders. Of course, that person can. They can deal with, like, you guys are getting a divorce. You're stressed out about starting college. You're stressed out about going to graduate school. A clinical person can indeed do that, right? But notice that their specialty is perhaps the more chronic sense instead of the acute short-term sense. So if you're looking forward into the more faster pace, right? And maybe counseling is a good fit. And if you're looking to working with a client for very long term, more than 6 months, more than a year, 2, 3, 5, and maybe clinical is the best fit for you. So any questions about that? Good deal. Generally, clinical sense, they deal with the more severe because they tend to be more chronic. They tend to be long-term. Let's talk a little bit more about health psychology. And a lot of people, especially people who are in public health, they find this field very interesting. What we're trying to look into in health psychology is that we're noticing the psychological, biological, and social factors that deal with health and illness. What does that mean in the Queen's English, right? What does that mean in plain English? It means that a person who specializes in health psychology is looking, what do I need? What type of behaviors, what type of attitudes, behaviors, beliefs lead people to engage in certain behaviors that affect their health or affect their illnesses. That's what a person in health psychology does. They are very geared, very, very geared in saying what led to this aspect of health, what led to this aspect of illness. And I'll give you a very easy example. A health psychologist might be concerned as to what leads people into using a condom or not using a condom, right? So we're going to investigate, for example, what beliefs led to the use or not use of a condom, what values led to that, what behaviors led or did not lead to using a condom, because we know that using a condom, whether it be a male condom or a female condom, right? Using either one is going to reduce the chances of you getting a disease that could be present the rest of your life. So it sounds like a minor inconvenience for the reduction of something that's a great inconvenience, right? Being sick the rest of your life. But a health psychologist is focused on what factors did in fact lead to that behavior or not using it. Another question that a health psychologist might be able to answer is perspectives of donating blood or receiving blood, right? Because if I am dying and I need a blood transfusion, what is the likelihood that the individual is going to comply with medical recommendations or medical treatment? Those are the kinds of questions that a health psychologist will be looking forward. Any questions about that? Good deal. In a general sense, a lot of individuals can indeed get a doctorate in health psychology, but generally what you see is the person is going to have a PhD in clinical psychology, but they have a specialty in health, right? So you may see them as an actual degree, or you may see it as a specialty. So if you're still interested in the clinical sense and health psychology appeals to you, maybe you can get a subspecialty in health psychology. Now, any questions about health psychology? Good deal. Let's talk a little bit about neuropsychology. Neuropsychology. This is one of the fields that is very, very closely related to the medical field, other than clinical. Clinical and neuropsychology are perhaps the closest to the medical model to psychiatry in general, in a very broad sense, right? So they're very close to that medical perspective. Now, neuropsychology is an immensely intense field. I would argue it's probably one of the hardest, if not the hardest field in psychology, followed by clinical, right? It's extensive. It requires a lot of education and practice, internship, residency, just like clinical, because the intent of neuropsychology is looking into that link, studying brain and the relationship with behavior. For those of you who have taken biology classes or biopsychological classes or psychopharmacology, notice that a lot of that information might have come very easily from a neuropsychologist, because a neuropsychologist is interested in answering questions such as, if I receive a head trauma here, what's going to happen, right? Because they're looking into that relationship between our central nervous system. How does that impact your behavior? So that could be an answer. They would try to answer questions such as, where does autism come from? That's the type of perspective that you can find with a neuropsychologist. That was actually one of my fields that I had considered as an undergrad, was neuropsychology. Number one, pays really well. It pays really well. The second highest paying, by the way, if you were curious, this is perhaps number one, and clinical is perhaps number two. Fun little fact. So notice that because they are closely related, you can also get a degree, a doctorate in clinical, have a specialty for neuropsych. So that is also a possibility. If that is interesting and appealing to you, you can actually mix the two degrees if that's something that is appealing. So any questions about that? Good deal. Let's continue on with our services, right? Let's continue on with the rest of the services. Look at that perfect line. Look at that. I'm getting good at this. I'm getting better. Let me see if I can do a little person. Oh, not yet. There we go. I tried. But speaking of people, let's talk about community psychology. Look at that. Look at my little community. They're so happy. What we're trying to do with community psychology is we're trying to engage with the communities in order to provide that strength. We're trying to look into how social systems are meeting the community's needs. This sounds an awful lot like which field? Like, would you guys tell me? The community psychology aspect of things, I'm trying to look into how can I change these circumstances? How can I change the circumstances that surround you, right? So for example, I live in a bad neighborhood, therefore I have to carry a knife with me all the time for protection. How can we change the circumstances of these individuals instead of coping? How can I change those circumstances instead of teaching this individual how to cope with those circumstances? Very different approach. Very, very different approach. I would argue that a lot of it is pretty, I wouldn't say against, but it is very different than counseling and clinical, because specifically for clinical, the intent is to assess, to diagnose, in order to treat, and provide those coping skills, things of that nature. Whereas in community psychology, I'm not looking for that assessment, diagnosis, and therapy so that you learn those coping skills necessarily. What I'm trying to do, let's change your system. Let's change those circumstances. These individuals are the ones that you're going to see heavily involved in community changes. So for example, new policies, changes in law, changes in infrastructure, things of that nature. You don't go to school, let's build a school in your community. I have to remind you that this is not common. This is perhaps one of the more rare service subfields. It is not a common field. Any questions about community psychology? Any questions? Fantastic. I'm lacking with my fantastics. I need to get better at that. Other my lines are super straight. Let's revert back to our slides. And let's look at rehabilitation psychology. The intent is that the individual is going to work with a person who is struggling with a disability. Someone who is suffering from a life change that was significant, for example, a stroke, a car accident, someone who now is trying to adjust to this specific control and management of a disability. Notice that this can also include drug rehabilitation. Now, the purpose of rehabilitation psychology is that we're going to adapt. We're going to adapt to our situation. Why is that? Because I have issues with adjusting. I have an issue with adjusting to this new situation. Therefore, let's try and adapt to it. Let's try to adapt to it. So in a sense, just like a clinical psychologist, here's the problem, let's adjust to it. Just like a counselor, here's the problem, you were married, you're not married anymore, that's a difficulty, let's cope with it, let's adjust to it. That is very similar in that fashion with rehabilitation psychology. That's right, that's why you have drug rehab counselors, right? This is very similar. Any questions about rehabilitation psychology? Good deal, good deal. Let's look into school psychology. Now, this is immensely interesting. Some of you might have had your own school psychologist or school counselor. Notice that we again see the term counseling, right? And again, if you see that term counseling, I want you to think about acute, right? Meaning short term, right? Short term situations. So the point of a school psychologist is to provide counseling, meaning acute, short-term advice to assist those involved in a school setting, right? So it extends to the student, extends beyond that because we can deal with parents and faculty, right? So a lot of people think about school psychology and they simply think about the students, but remember that a good practitioner looks at all the variables at hand, I should say. Therefore, a good practitioner is also involved with that counseling advice to parents and teachers. Primarily, the questions, the situations, the presenting issues that a school psychologist is going to deal with is career guidance. Generally, they would answer questions such as, what school should I apply to? How am I going to adjust living on my own at the dorm? Right? Those are the types of questions that a school psychologist may answer. We do have our own counseling center here, for those of you who didn't know. It's actually across the street in a really hidden place to ensure more privacy. And those would be the types of questions that that individual can help you with. So any questions about that? Fantastic. Here is an applied subfield, human factors, also known as engineering psychology. Engineering psychology. And whenever you see engineering, by the way, is the applied science of math. So therefore, if we have engineering psychology, it means that it is applied, right? Notice that the main goal of human factors is studying the interaction, that relationship between humans and technology. For example, having more robots in a setting. How would you feel instead of taking this lecture live? How would you feel taking it with an AI version of myself, right? You're like, what? We don't need two of you, right? You don't need, the world's not ready for two Dr. Shars. Okay, it's just not, it's too much to handle. So that would be one of the questions that they would look into. Similarly, environmental psychology is then focused in that dynamic, but instead of technology and human, we're looking into a person and its environment. Now, something really interesting about environmental psychology is what types of behaviors, right, do we engage in? So for example, we're trying to have some form of conservation, right, preserving our behavior. How do we manage our resources? How do you manage your resources? How much oil do we spend? How do we drink water? How much do we spend on water? Now, any questions about that? Good deal. So let's move into sport psychology. Sports psychology. The intent of sports psychology, I like to call this the performance science, right? PE science. Why do I call it that? Because the intent is to address aspects of competition, right? Aspects of how am I going to deal with the stress that comes with competition. Any athletes here or future athletes or past athletes? All right. So notice that the role of the sports psychologist is to address aspects that come with performance. So for example, competition, becoming motivated, and also dealing with the emotions that come from said competition and said motivation. I met a sports psychologist. He's from Canada, and him and I, we did our residency, our clinical residency together. So we traveled to Canada just to do his residency to the United States. And one of the things that he would mention is that often, a lot of the things that individuals in the sports sense, some of the times, a lot of panic attacks occur because of individuals who are in the performing aspects. And by the way, this extends to anything performance, musicians, so not just athletes, musicians, artists, actors, right? So this does extend further, right? It does extend further. And he was mentioning how panic attacks, obsessive behavior, compulsive behavior, lack of motivation, hindrance in performance, those are the questions that a sports psychologist would attempt to answer. Those are the aspects that a sports psychologist would attempt to do. Any questions about that? All right, good deal. And we still have more applied subfields. Let's look at industrial organization. Now, don't get this confused with human factors or engineering psychology, because we're not looking so much, although it could, but we're not looking strictly at that interaction between humans and technology. We are thinking about industrial and organizational psychology. We're looking for the application of behavioral principles in the workplace, right? Wherever there's behavior, there is psychology. And of course, there's a whole lot of behavior going on in your workplace. Think about your last job or your current job, right? There's a whole lot going on there, right? So notice that the intent is to apply those principles, those cognitive behavioral aspects that we have learned through research and practice. Let's apply them in the workplace. So notice that we're not necessarily focused in that abnormal, normal side of things, right? Notice that in this particular case, I am looking to improve productivity. I'm looking to improve productivity. I like to think about industrial psychology, and this is perhaps not the best way to look at industrial, but that's just how I look at it. So take that as you will. I like to look at industrial psychology as the field that exploits employees, right? Why is that? Because my job is to ensure that you perform to the peak of your ability, right? So for example, if I know that if I play music in the workplace, generally, whatever music, really doesn't matter which music. If I play music in the workplace, generally people perform better. So if I know that, and you start, instead of typing, 100 words per minute, now you start typing 125, I feel almost like that's a form of exploitation, because you're not doing this knowingly, right? So I like to think about that. But again, that's my personal opinion, right? But it is necessary because employers are there to provide a service, right? And who provides the service? It's employees. So I understand the need for industrial psychology. I know that anybody watching this video is going to be like, what? She said what about industrial, right? Now, one of the things that I like to think about industrial psychology is not only the employees, but also the clients, right? Also the clients. What do I mean by that? I want you to think about the last fast food place you went to, right? And think about the last time you went to a nice restaurant, right? If you notice, an industrial psychologist had to come up with an idea. How is it that I can increase the performance and clientele of this establishment? How do we do that? Think about that fast food restaurant. Most fast food restaurants, and now next time you drive next to one, you're gonna remember this. Most fast food restaurants are open. They have bay windows, right? They have bay windows. Usually they're super bright, right? Very well lit. And they have really big, big windows. Sometimes the whole wall is a window. Right? Why is that? Because we tend to eat faster when we're being observed. If I can get you in and out in 20 minutes, that's another table that I have for the next bite and the next bite and the next bite. That's why I call fast food, isn't it? Whereas in a restaurant, it's not so much about the food, is it? It's about the experience. So notice that it's kind of darker. You got some dim lights. The chairs are pretty. The presentation is pretty. And how long do you spend in a restaurant? An hour, hour and a half, compared to like 15, 20 minutes in a fast food? That is something industrial psychologists have to think about. That's why I call it the exploitation. That's why I call it that. In a joking way, of course, in a joking way. Another aspect that industrial psychology, I should say, is involved with is the leadership and communication. Again, if I am trying to improve that workplace experience, that productivity, then I need good leaders and good communication. Good leaders and good communication. Now, this is something that I truly enjoy because yours truly, her specialty is forensic psychology. When you hear forensic, every time you hear this word, I want you to think about CSI Miami, and that kind of stuff. Every time you hear the term forensic in the social sciences sense, I want you to think about anything legal. And what is anything legal? Think about the court system, police, military, juvenile correctional facilities, prison, jail, anything related to the law, anything related to the legal system. Now, one of the things that we're trying to do is apply the principles of behavior, but in a legal sense. I absolutely love this field. The only reason I didn't get a doctorate in forensic psychology is because the state that I was living in did not recognize a forensic psychology degree in order to become licensed. That was literally the only reason why I did it. And then I figured, well, clinical pays a little bit more, so let's do that. I'll get a specialty so I can satisfy my little desires in forensic psychology, right? But notice that those are decisions that you are going to have to make. What is the best career path for me? So in that case, forensic was not, even though it was my desire, but I decided to get my specialty in forensic, even though my doctorate is in clinical. One of the things that a forensic psychologist or someone specializing in the field of forensics is they're going to deal with expert witness. A lot of the things that individuals in forensic psychology do is provide expert witness testimony. And just as a little caveat, I'm going to give you a description of a witness and an expert witness. What's the difference? A witness is there to report on an event, report on character, right? You can have a character witness to say, oh my God, Dr. Shar didn't do that because she's so great. There's no way she did that. And then you take the stand as a character witness. Or you have a witness and they would say, oh, I totally saw her. I totally saw her running away with a Twix bar, out of the convenience store. I totally saw that. An expert witness, on the other hand, they are not tied to that case. They are there because they are considered experts and recognized in their field and know enough science to be able to comment and assist the judge and the jury in making a decision. That's the difference between an expert witness and just a general witness. You are there because you know a lot of stuff, is what I'm trying to say. And because you do know a lot of stuff, we want to hear what you have to say. Now, another thing that a person in the forensic field can do is dealing with child custody. Child custody. This is relatively common. That is one of the more common phone calls. Every now and then we'll get a phone call saying if we can do any sort of child custody evaluation. That does happen. Or criminal cases. For those of you who assisted in or were present in PsyChi's presentation the other day, we had an individual by the name of Erica Marsh, and she was the guest speaker for that presentation. And part of her job is to work with the public defender's office in the federal court system here in our state. And her job is to find mitigation. What's a mitigating factor? First of all, that's a legal term. It's not a psychology term. And mitigation is what aspects decrease or make it less responsible for a crime. So for example, think about an individual who has murdered someone. But it turns out that potentially a mitigating factor is that that person had raped convicted his or her entire life. That could be a mitigating factor, right? It doesn't mean that this person is going to not be prosecuted, but instead of murder one, which would be premeditated, maybe they get murder two, maybe they get manslaughter. So notice that the point of mitigation is presenting what are some factors that decrease that perception. An aggravator, on the other hand, is what made it worse. So for example, the person, instead of shooting the individual one time, the person shot him 20 times, went back, reloaded, and came back again and shot the person. There is such a case. There's this case, she's called the Killer Grandma. by the way. And that's exactly what she did. She reloaded like 3 or 4 times to kill her son-in-law. So of course, she argued self-defense, but shoot someone, you have to reload 3 times, go back home, reload, back again, reload. So notice that a psychologist or a person that works in forensic psychology would try to evaluate said behavior, right? So I will link her presentation below. It is immensely interesting. You guys have the opportunity to listen to what Ms. Erica Marsh presented. She talks about real cases of people that she has helped in the federal court to mitigate their cases. So I highly recommend that you watch that if you have a chance. It's going to be linked down below. Now, forensic psychologists can go anywhere between selecting the jury. This is way before the trial has even begun. Notice that they can help in selecting the jury to helping individuals with their testimony. So they are there the entirety of the way. Ms. Marsh in the past had contacted me because she wanted me to work with competency of individuals. So competency to be able to assist in their own defense, their competency of not being guilty by reason of insanity. And she also wanted me to work with the competency of whether or not a person should be executed in our state. Fortunately, that's something I can't do right now, but it's in the back burner. So whenever I can, I will, because that is immensely beneficial. I think it's a good contribution to society to be able to contribute to the justice system in whichever way. Any questions? Any questions about forensic psychology? All right. We talked about service. We talked about applied. Let's talk about experimental subfields. Now, remember, we need research in order to do practice. So a lot of the information that we use in practice has come from these experimental subfields. The first one that I want to talk about is cognitive and perceptual psychology. We wouldn't be able to carry on behavior if we didn't sense and perceive the stimuli around us. Right? We wouldn't be able to because we're not robots, right? We need sensation. We need perception. We need the interpretation of said stimuli in order to process our behavior. One of the aspects that cognitive and perceptual psychology will be interested in is how is it that we learn? How do we learn? What mechanisms are in play in order to learn something? So notice that a lot of the things that I tried to do here in the classroom are based on research that we have in learning. Actually move around quite a lot. So hopefully that keeps you guys awake, right? Another question that we may be interested in this experimental subfield is language. How do we learn? How do we process? How do we replicate language? What are the gears, if you will, that put language processes in play and the actual language process itself? Now, just like I said, every time you hear the term forensic, I want you to hear legal. The same goes for cognition. Every time you hear cognition, I want you to hear the word thinking. Why is that? Because cognition refers to all of those processes that we simply cannot see with the naked eye. I can see decision making. I can see memory. I can see your rational judgment. I know what it would look like as a behavior, but I can't look at cognition directly. How much does intelligence weigh, right? What color is intelligence, right? So notice that cognition is focused on the aspects of thinking, things that I cannot observe directly, but I can in fact observe the outcomes of said not direct observed factor. Generally, when we are thinking about this specific factor, notice that the vast majority, right, the majority of experimental psychology is indeed focused on the cognitive and perceptual side of things. Any questions about that? Good deal, beautiful people, and that will be the end of our lecture.